글로벌 금융위기 이후 경제 권력의 축은 아시아로 이동하고 있으며 이 같은 현상은 앞으로 더욱 강화될 것이다. 아시아 태평양 지역 경제 전문가 라지브 비즈워즈의 분석인데요. 그의 말처럼 현재 전 세계에는 금융위기 이후 세계 경제 성장을 이끌고 있는 이머징 시장을 주목하고 있습니다. 미래 주도 세력으로서 확실한 자리매김을 하고 있는 이머징 마켓. 이미 오래전부터 그 가능성을 제시해온 라지브 비즈워즈. 그는 왜 이런 생각을 하게 된 걸까요? 그리고 그에 대응하는 전략은 어떻게 제시하고 있을까요?
Thank you for our interview. And according to your previous interview with eDaily, you said it is time for South Korea to plan for its new strategic industry. Well, it will have global competitive advantages for the next 20 to 30 years. The experience of other high-income nations such as German, Japanese, Singapore and Switzerland could help South Korea plan and prepare the path for its future economy. So, what business or industry do you believe be promising for Korea after 20-30 years? Also, what is the implication of the experience of high-income countries such as Germany, Japan, Singapore?
I think when you look at Korea's current position, it's extremely strong as a heavy industrial manufacturing nation. And I think for at least 10 more years, Korea is very well positioned to do extremely well around the Asia Pacific and around the world in these industries. But as we have seen in other industrial nations in the rest of the world, such as Japan, and also in Europe, we've seen examples where countries start to have very high wages. Their competitiveness starts to decline in these heavy industrial sectors, and new nations will rise over the future years, inevitably, in manufacturing. So Korea already needs to plan for the future how to position its economy so that the hollowing out of the economy doesn't become a big problem for Korean society. In order to keep employment and keep the economy dynamic, then you need to strategically plan for the future. And this is what we have seen in countries like Singapore or Switzerland. And I would particularly mention Singapore because they're very strategic planning for change. Singapore used to be a country with a big manufacturing industry, but over the years, the low-cost manufacturing has left. But in the meantime, the government really led the nation towards having more strategic, competitive industries, such as high value-added manufacturing in pharmaceuticals and high precision engineering, and also in new service sector industries such as financial services. Really, you saw that Singapore emerged as one of Asia's biggest financial centers within the last 30 years. So this was quite a massive transformation that we saw. And I think when we look at Korea, a similar process needs to happen, that already the government and industry needs to be thinking 20 years out and saying, how can we position for this change? And I think, Korea has many opportunities in new industry areas. I think particularly in the financial services sector, there's a lot of potential for Korea to emerge as an important financial center. Why? And the reason is because Asia Pacific is the fastest growing region of the world, and the demand for financial services in Asia is growing more quickly than anywhere else in the world. And in particular, if you look at, say, China, India, or ASEAN countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, the demand for financial services in these countries is growing very quickly. So I think it's in these kind of markets that Korean financial services, banking, insurance, asset management could develop. Of course, at the moment, the Korean industry is still, in the banking sector, is still relatively at an early stage of globalization. But we're talking 20 years out, so I think planning for 20 years, we could see a big change happening. Other industries that I think have a lot of potential are other service sector industries such as logistics, I think freight forwarding and shipping and so on. These are areas where, again, Korea could have advantage. And other high value added services such as healthcare and also tourism. Tourism is also an important potential industry. So these are the sort of areas where Korea needs to position. It doesn't mean that manufacturing will disappear, because I think we'll still see that many of the world's largest manufacturing companies will be Korean. The headquarters will be here. A lot of the services and support will be here. And in manufacturing, of course, some of the high-end manufacturing will still be here. But also, I think the more competitive nature of the global economy means the big companies need to also have plants and equipment elsewhere in the world, such as we saw Hyundai already invested in India in a big way and are very successful there. And I think this model we'll need to see in more and more Korean companies in future.
According to your interview with the press in this year, early year, you emphasized that Korea needs to focus the trading with Asian region and for foster small businesses and financial industry in order to retain growing momentum.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think Korea needs to promote the financial industry?
Well, I think because it's one of the fastest growing industries in the world. In the Asia-Pacific region in particular, I think there's a lot of potential for growth in this area. And I think there's two major things that have happened in the last 5 years. The first is, during the global financial crisis, the Western banks, the European and American banks, were very badly hit. Their balance sheets were hurt. And in the past, they had a very strong leadership role in the financial services industry worldwide. But now they're not able to play that same role in the future because they're suffering quite badly from the global financial crisis. And on the other hand, the second big trend that we're seeing is that Asia is growing very quickly. So the markets in Asia, particularly China, India, and ASEAN countries, are going to be very rapidly growing markets for financial services. So I think this is a very big opportunity for the future, and that Asian countries, not only Korea, but also other countries, need to be positioned in the financial services industry so that it becomes more diversified. And the industry and societies of Asia are not relying only on the international banks from Europe and America. I think we saw during the global financial crisis that a lot of trade in Asia was badly hit because international trade finance really was very much curtailed because international banks were not lending for trade finance. And this is another area where if we have countries such as Korea, China, India playing a bigger role in trade finance around Asia Pacific and in the rest of the world, it reduces the risks that, you know, a crisis in Europe will also damage trade flows in Asia because nobody wants to finance them. So I think there's many reasons why financial services is an important area where Korea and other Asian countries need to develop their global footprint.
According to your presentation elaboration, you have predicted an average rate of economic growth for the next 3 to 4 is approximately 4% for Korea. What is the reason?
I think at the moment, of course, Korea is already a relatively developed country, and so 4% is quite a good growth rate at the moment. Of course, Korea has many competitive advantages, and we're seeing at the moment that Korean exports are very strong. And I think Korea's export advantage will continue to be a key growth driver over the medium term. So I think, you know, at least 4% growth per year should be achievable. It's possible that it could even be, you know, between 4 to 5% growth over the next 5 years, which for a developed country like Korea is actually quite a good growth rate. When you see what's happening in Europe, where countries, the whole of Europe, cannot grow more than 2% over the next 5 years each year, then I think you can see that Korea growing at 4 to 5% a year is actually quite a strong performance. So I think this number of 4 to 5% growth reflects confidence that Korea is actually quite a strong competitive economy. And in particular, I think the biggest factor that is going to be driving Korean exports will be the relationship with China. China is already the biggest market for Korea, but in the future, we expect within 10 years, China will become the world's largest economy. And of course, this will help to drive Korean exports to China. And the other country that's growing very quickly is India. And I know Korea-India relations are very strong already. And there's a lot of trade flows already, but it'll grow more in future. So both of these things are helping to drive the growth of the Korean economy.
Okay. And do you know the Bank of Korea has increased the interest rate to 3.25% last week? Do you think that tight monetary policy is continue in Asian country?
I think at the moment we've seen a year, the first half of this year, where inflation pressures were rising in most of emerging Asia. And the reason for this is that commodity prices were rising very quickly. Food prices at the moment are at a record high globally. So that's one reason. But also, of course, is oil prices. But because of the political unrest in the Middle East, we saw the oil prices rising quite significantly. On top of that, we had floods in Australia, which pushed up coal prices, and other commodity prices have also been quite high for other things, such as base metals. So we are in an environment where high commodity prices have pushed up inflation for emerging Asia. So it's not a problem only for Korea, but we are seeing that inflation pressures are increasing in the first half of this year, and therefore central banks throughout emerging Asia have been lifting their interest rates. And of course, the Bank of Korea also has tightened monetary policy. I think the problem is different for different countries because not everybody is having exactly the same pressures. The biggest pressures are facing Vietnam and India, which have very high inflation. I think Korea is more in the middle range where inflation pressures are still relatively moderate but have been rising. So of course it's quite right that the central bank was tightening. We forecast that the central bank will still tighten a little bit more in the second half of the year. But we don't think that the inflation pressures will be rising much more from here. So we think that inflation pressures in Korea will gradually start to stabilize because we've already seen commodity prices came down a little bit. And we think that although we think world growth will be relatively good in the second half, we still think that the commodity price impact won't be so severe in the second half of the year as it was in the first half. Things like coal prices should be coming down. We already saw some of the base metal prices came down. So this should help to reduce the inflation pressures somewhat. So we think that the central bank, with some more tightening, we expect only 2 more steps of tightening in the second half of the year in Korea will be enough to moderate inflation pressures in Korea.
Okay, yes. You're a native of India, and how do you protect India's economic outlook?
I think India is the next big rising Asian economy after China. I think there's been a lot of steps taken in the last 20 years to reform the Indian economy. It's still much smaller than China, but I think the growth rate has picked up. We now see Indian economic growth every year, about 8 to 9% growth per year. So it's really moving fast. And one important thing is there's been a big increase in foreign direct investment into the Indian economy in many different sectors like manufacturing, real estate and urban development and infrastructure. So I think we're seeing signs that the Indian economy is moving more rapidly. It also faces many challenges. In particular, the infrastructure is quite weak. So they need to spend a lot of money on infrastructure development. And actually, this is a big opportunity for Korea because Korea is very strong in construction and infrastructure. So I think one great partnership for the future will be between Korea and India to help India develop its infrastructure in ports, railways, roads, and many other areas where Korea is a leader. And India really needs some international help to have the capacity to develop these sectors. So I really see there's a big future for the bilateral trade and investment between Korea and India.
Yes, among the Asian countries, you have a positive outlook for Indonesia. What is the basis of opinion?
I think when you look at the next 20 years, the biggest feature of the world economy is the rise of China and also of India. And these countries are both in a phase where they need a lot of economic development, and this needs raw materials. They need the commodities. And Indonesia's great strength is that it's exporting many commodities, such as coal, also agricultural commodities, and this is what China and India need. So already China and India are investing quite a lot in Indonesian projects to try to access these resources. So I see a big future for Indonesia as a supplier of resources to these two big economies. But also Indonesia has a big population itself, and we're seeing that the domestic demand is growing quite quickly. So not only do we have the resources demand, but also we see quite strong growth in private consumption. And I think in the next few years, industrial development will also become an important factor as companies invest, because the spending power of Indonesian households is growing quite quickly. So actually Indonesia, you can think of that after China and India, it's the next Asian BRIC economy. And I think a lot of foreign investment will also come into Indonesia for the domestic market as well as resource sector. So that's why I'm quite positive about the outlook for Indonesia.
Okay. And Japan suffered a nationwide disaster in last March from earthquake and tsunamis. How will the Japan crisis affect Korea economic, and how long it will take to restore Japan's economy?
Of course, it is a great tragedy that hit Japan in March, and we have seen that it had a very devastating effect on industrial production. In March, industrial production in Japan fell by 15%, which is a very huge drop. And now in the second quarter of this year, we see a lot of supply chain problems where the Japanese components for autos, electronic sector are not being produced in the sufficient quantities, and therefore many countries around the Asia Pacific are suffering because they cannot get those essential components for their industry. But I think the other issue is that there's a big reconstruction job needed. About $300 billion of reconstruction is needed in Japan. So we think that the bad news is now. The second quarter, we see a lot of negative impact in Japan, but when we come to the second half of the year, industrial production will gradually start to return towards normal, and we think by the end of the year, industrial production should be back to at least normal levels. And on top of that, reconstruction spending will start soon. So we actually expect that next year, the Japanese economy will grow very strongly, that growing at about 4% next year. And this will be quite a big growth engine for the whole of the Asia Pacific. But particularly for Korea, I think this will be an important driver of growth in Northeast Asia. That Japan, which is the third biggest economy in the world, is growing very rapidly. 4% growth in Japan is actually very strong. So this will have positive transmission effects throughout the Asia Pacific region, we think, both through construction and restoring industrial production to normal. So I think, of course, it was a terrible disaster, but now the road to recovery will start quite soon, we think, and by next year it will have a positive impact on the region.
Okay. And after the global economic depression, there are many opinions that economic recovery has been weaker than before. Bill Gross, the CIO of PIMCO, has called it the new normal. Do you agree with it?
I think basically we are facing a very difficult situation in the global economy where, two of the major economic regions, the US and Europe, which were the growth drivers for the world economy for many years, are suffering a lot of difficulties with government debt. Both in the US and in Europe, the problems of government debt will take many years to solve. So when you look at the outlook, it's not good. I already mentioned that in Europe the outlook is quite weak, but the US also faces difficulties to reduce their government debt levels. Therefore, we're in a new world, I think. It's true, it's a new normal, but it's also a new structure of the global economy where we have seen a shift of economic power from the west to the east. This already started many years ago, but I think it's gathering momentum now because of the problems confronting the US and Europe after the global financial crisis. And I think this is a major shift taking place, and we're seeing very much the rise in importance of Asia as the new leader for global economic growth. So I think this is what we're now seeing as a result of all these problems, that China, India, and other Asian countries are really playing a much bigger role in the world economy, and we are seeing a reshaping of the global economic order. This has many implications because it means that the global leadership is changing. You know, we now saw the G20, which met in Korea last year. It's a new leadership structure. Many developing countries are also on the table for these discussions. But I also think when we look at the IMF, World Bank, now there's a lot of discussion. Why are the leaders of the World Bank and IMF only from the US and Europe? So this is now also being discussed. As Asia grows in economic power, there's a questioning of the legitimacy of these old ways of doing business and ruling the global economy. I think in the future we need to see, emerging market countries also taking a role in leadership of IMF and World Bank. And this is coming from this new economic power that we're seeing in Asia. The other thing that it implies is that the future of consumer demand is driven out of Asia. The biggest growth in consumer markets used to come out of Europe and the US. So most multinational strategy for their corporate strategy for the next 10 years used to be thinking about markets in the US and Europe. Now, most multinationals are focusing on Asia, how to position for the growth in consumer markets in Asia. So the role of Asia is growing not only in terms of governance, but also for corporate strategy as global companies are increasingly focusing on this part of the world. And I think this isn't going to change. We're now in a new... So the new normal is not only about the lesser role of Europe and the US in terms of economic growth, but it's also about the rise of Asia. And there's many positives from this as well. It's not only negative news. I think there's many good things that are coming from this new structure of the global economy.
I see you love Asia.
I'm from Asia, so it's good to see this. And I think, a lot of the world's population live in Asia. If you look at the population of China and India, Indonesia, these are the biggest populations in the world. So I think it's important for the living standards and economic development of the global economy of the Asian people that we see this change taking place. So it's quite exciting. I mean, it's good for Asia, and it's good for the people of Asia to see this change going on. And of course, Korea will, I hope, play a very big role in all of this, because Korea is a leader in industrial technology and has a lot of capability that will help other developing countries in Asia Pacific and other parts of the world as well.
Thank you for joining our interview. And today is very impression day for me to meet you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to join you today.
라지브 비주어즈는 인터뷰에서도 말했듯 인도 출신의 경제학자인데요. 자신이 아시아인인 만큼 아시아에 대한 애정이 남다를 수밖에 없다는 그 남다른 애정이 그가 아시아 시장과 경제를 다른 학자들보다 더욱 치밀하게 분석할 수 있도록 하지 않았나라는 생각이 들었습니다.